This audio fanfic is rated K, which is the same as a movie rating of G for general audiences. This is intended for all ages. For more information on what the rating means, please go to www.esrb.com.
Of Mothers, Marshwiggles, and Burnt Cookies. Scrubb Residence, November 27th, 5 years after the Silver Chair.
Eustace Clarence?
Eustace Clarence Scrubb looked up from his book at the sound of his name. Alberta, no, Mum, he reminded himself, stood looking down at him, a stack of books in her arms.
Yes, Mum,
he replied, catching himself with some difficulty. Alberta put her head to one side and sighed at her son's curious behavior.
Eustace Clarence, your cousin phoned this morning. Lucy Pevensie?
She paused.
You know, Helen's daughter.
Eustace barely managed to keep from groaning at his mother's tone.
Yes, Mom, I know who Lucy is.
Alberta rolled her eyes and shrugged.
Well, yes, I'm sure you would, especially considering she and that brother of hers stayed with us that one summer. Though it has been several years, you know.
What did she phone about?
Eustace asked, suppressing the temptation to roll his eyes. Alberta set down her books on the table and scratched her head, fiddling with the bobby pin absently.
Well, she told me that when I invited her family over for dinner, you invited that girl, too.
That girl?
Eustace asked, raising an eyebrow in question. Alberta gave him a pointedly annoyed look and sighed again.
Yes, that girl. Your friend from school?
Comprehension dawned in Eustace's mind.
Oh, Pole, right. It's all right if she comes over this afternoon, isn't it? The Pevensies got into town a few days ago, and Pole and I really wanted to discuss some things with Edmund and Lucy.
Alberta nodded, but her son noticed a strange look in her eyes.
What is it?
He asked, meeting her gaze.
Nothing, Eustace Clarence,
she replied, swallowing hard.
I'm just glad you aren't going by first names. Yet.
Then she turned abruptly and left the room, leaving Eustace to puzzle over this strange, rather unexpected statement. At exactly 6 o'clock the doorbell rang. Eustace scrambled to get to the door before Alberta, ran a hand through his tousled hair, and opened the large wooden door with his heart beating rather quickly. Helen and David Pevensie, who was home on furlough, stood just outside. They greeted him with a quick,
Hello, Eustace,
and a hug. Uncle David shook his hand, and then made their way past him. Susan, who was just behind her parents, gave her cousin a quick smile and hugged him tightly.
How are you, Eustace?
She asked, rumpling his hair with a slightly patronizing grin that was at least meant well.
Wonderful, thanks.
Eustace replied quickly, forcing a smile as Susan swept past him into the house. Peter was next, greeting him with a firm handshake.
It's good to see you, Eustace,
he said with a smile.
I don't believe you were so tall the last time we saw you.
Eustace grimaced and shook his head.
Mum says I've grown like a weed. I'm almost as tall as her now.
Eustace!
Lucy was the next person to address him. She stepped forward to give him a hug before he could get out of the way.
How good to see you again. And isn't it simply wonderful that we got into town just in time to be here so we could have dinner with you on the only night you're free? I was so pleased.
It's good of you to come,
Eustace replied, tactfully extricating himself from the youngest Pevensie's warm embrace, which he didn't mind nearly as much as Susan's. Lucy waltzed in to give Auntie Alberta a hug, and Edmund, the closest of all his cousins, held out his hand, which Eustace promptly shook.
Hello, old chap,
he said with a grin.
Had any more sword practice since we last saw you?
Eustace grinned back and shook his head.
Not much, though Pole and I usually have a few rounds of archery every now and again.
Edmund nodded, and his dark eyes looked serious.
Never know when you might get back. It's best to keep in practice.
Then he pushed past Eustace without another word. No Jill. Eustace glanced around the corner of the porch and gave a disappointed sigh as his friend failed to appear.
I guess she couldn't come.
he muttered, returning to the house reluctantly. Then, just as he was about to shut the door, he heard the quick honk of an automobile horn, and doors slamming shut from somewhere on the street.
Scrubb!
Eustace opened the door again, and a relieved smile crossed his face at the sight of his friend.
Pole, I thought you'd never show up.
Jill raced up the steps to his front door and beamed up at him.
Never show up indeed. I'm only 2 minutes late.
Her cheeks were rosy with the chill in the air, and her light brown curls gleamed in the porch light.
Come on in,
Eustace said, gesturing to the door, his throat suddenly gone dry.
but you better watch out. Mum's a bit cross this evening. Harold had work and couldn't be here for dinner, and they had a fight.
Jill nodded solemnly, looking a bit concerned for a moment, and then grinned at him.
I'll be on my best behavior.
After a few minutes of introductions, everyone gathered around the table for dinner. At his parents' request, Peter blessed the meal, and the Pevensies, Alberta, Eustace, and Jill ate their supper with rather less than the usual fuss and conversation. Eustace couldn't help but notice the suspicious looks that Alberta kept giving Jill. The talk was mostly between the adults, with a word here and there from Susan or Peter. Though Edmund and Lucy managed to appear interested, Jill was beginning to look rather bored as she finished her meal and pushed back in her chair.
So, Jill,
Alberta finally brought herself to say, stumbling over the name.
You're in Eustace's classes at the Experiment House?
Dreadful name for a school.
Eustace muttered, leaning back in his chair and pushing his plate forward with a sigh of contentment.
Yes, we are in a few of the same classes.
Jill admitted.
We take grammar, arithmetic, and archery together. But archery's only on Wednesdays.
Alberta raised an eyebrow, but nodded in acknowledgement.
I see.
Do you have a bow?
Susan asked suddenly, ever the matchmaker, and glancing at Eustace. Jill blinked 3 times in succession. Eustace turned 3 shades of red. Lucy bit her lip and tried to keep from smiling. Edmund barely stifled a laugh. Finally, Jill managed to stammer an answer.
A bow? I'm afraid I don't quite know what you mean.
Oh, you know, dear.
Susan said, smiling condescendingly.
A sweetheart.
With all that lipstick on, her lips cover almost half her face.
Jill thought wickedly. Though we can perhaps excuse her for this thought due to the fact that it was mostly true. She shook her head decidedly, giving Alberta and Susan a sweet smile.
I'm afraid not. Only good friends.
She gave Eustace a quick wink, which Alberta noticed with growing apprehension. Susan, however, wasn't ready to let this conversation end without an answer that satisfied her.
But surely there's someone,
she said, flipping her dark hair behind her shoulders.
Every girl has somebody that they like.
Do you suppose she needs all that makeup that she's wearing?
Jill thought naughtily.
I'm afraid not.
Jill said out loud, leaning forward and raising an eyebrow.
I'm not exactly like every girl.
In the deafening silence that followed, Eustace knew that he had to do something, and by the look on Susan and Alberta's face, not to mention Jill's, he had better do it quickly.
Mum,
he asked, standing up abruptly.
is it all right if Pole and I make some cookies? I'm feeling awfully hungry for some dessert.
Alberta
Gave him a bewildered look. Cookies, Eustace Clarence? She asked. But I have some pies ready, and you don't know a thing.
Cookies!
Eustace confirmed, interrupting his mother.
I'll have some pie later. Besides, Mum, we never have cookies.
All right, Alberta replied after a moment's hesitation, shrugging and shaking her head. But be sure to clean up the mess when you're done. Eustace glanced at Jill, who hastily got to her feet. Together they walked quickly out of the living room. Eustace couldn't help but notice the wistful gaze that came from Lucy as she watched them go. When they shut the kitchen door, Jill leaned against the wall and let out a sigh of relief.
Thanks, Scrubb,
She told him gratefully.
I don't know how I ever managed to get into situations like that. The hostile looks your mother was giving me made me wonder if this dinner wasn't going to end up like the autumn feast in Harfang almost did.
Eustace still stood by the door, watching her contentedly and trying not to blush at her words of thanks.
Think nothing of it.
He replied, looking down.
It was getting a little uncomfortable for the rest of us, too.
Jill gave him a quick grin, and then shook her head with a rueful laugh.
A beau indeed. I think dear Cousin Sue was trying to make me angry.
She wanted to add,
And did you notice the little look she kept giving you?
but then decided against it, knowing how touchy Eustace could be when it came to talking about that sort of thing.
Do you know how to make cookies?
Eustace asked as he faced the kitchen, running a hand through his hair.
Because I have no idea.
Jill giggled once and shook her head in exasperation.
So, you volunteered me to make the cookies.
She said, giving him a playful poke in the arm.
Really, Scrubb. You don't know very much at all, do you?
Not about cookies.
Eustace replied with an apologetic grin.
All right.
Jill said, sighing and tossing her curls.
Bring me the flour, sugar, and vanilla. I assume you keep eggs and butter in the icebox?
Eustace nodded as he turned to face the many cabinets. Eventually, after much exploring, he found the flour and the sugar. Jill already had a mixing bowl out, and was stirring the butter in with 2 eggs.
It's lucky that we have those eggs, you know,
Eustace remarked, putting the sugar and flour bags on the counter with a thump.
My parents are vegetarians and we don't eat many animal products.
So why do you have the eggs?
Jill asked, blowing a stray hair out of her eyes and scooping the sugar into the bowl.
Mum went to a dinner the other night and needed the eggs for a cake.
Eustace replied, watching Jill as she stirred the bowl violently.
Those are left over.
Jill glanced over at him and then at the stack of ingredients.
Where's the vanilla?
Couldn't find it. I think we're out.
Jill sighed and shook her head.
Oh well. It's just for taste. Do you have any salt?
Right here.
Eustace said, pulling the box out of a drawer.
I appreciate this an awful lot, Pole. I absolutely love cookies.
It's no trouble at all. At least it's not much trouble.
Jill replied with a quick grin, stirring with a flourish. A few ingredients later, Jill covered 2 cookie trays with the cookie dough. Then she turned to the oven, turning one of the dials and frowning at it.
I wonder how one is supposed to tell when the oven is hot enough.
Eustace dipped a finger in the cookie bowl, tasted the dough, and shrugged casually.
I suppose you could stick a finger in, and if the oven is hot enough to burn it, then it's hot enough to bake the cookies.
Jill rolled her eyes and sighed at her friend's antics, but Eustace wasn't done.
But I suppose if that wasn't hot enough by that time,
He continued with a grin.
I'm sure that by the time you had finished hopping around the kitchen screaming, "My finger!" and shouting a verbal assault at the oven, it would probably be more than ready to bake the cookies.
Jill whirled around and swatted at his hand, which was dipping yet again in the cookie bowl.
Very funny.
She said, trying desperately, and failing, to keep a wide grin from crossing her face.
And stop eating raw cookie dough. It can give you salmonella, you know.
Eustace shrugged and dipped his finger in again, ignoring Jill's scorching glare.
What do you care?
He asked playfully, licking his fingers clean and sending her a grin.
For all you know, salmonella is a skin condition one gets from touching flour.
Jill stuck out her tongue at him.
Very funny.
She commented, picking up a piece of cookie dough and tasting it carefully.
Be careful you don't get salmonella,
Eustace teased, pulling one of her curls. Jill shot him another glare and then closed her eyes to concentrate on the taste. After a moment, she frowned and shook her head.
Too much salt,
she muttered, glaring at the bowl. She turned and picked up a cookie tray, sliding it into the oven quickly and making sure to keep her fingers clear of the hot surface. She did not want to hop around the kitchen screaming angrily at the oven as Eustace had suggested.
I think it tastes perfect,
came his voice from behind her.
I'm glad someone thinks so,
murmured Jill, slamming the oven shut.
You know, you two quarrel about as much as an old married couple,
said a dry voice from the door. Both Jill and Eustace whirled around. Edmund stood there, leaning against the doorframe and smirking at them, a humorous twinkle in his dark eyes. With a quick push from Lucy, who was behind him, Edmund stumbled into the room ungracefully.
What's the matter, Ed?
asked Peter with a grin, helping his brother up as he entered the room behind them.
Lose your balance?
I was tripped, Your Honour.
Edmund replied solemnly, standing and pointing at Lucy condemningly.
She's the guilty party.
His younger sister giggled at him and poked him in the stomach. Peter shook his head at the two of them.
Really, Ed? It's too bad your pitiless, evil, younger sister is always knocking you down.
he said, giving his younger brother a faked, compassionate glance. Edmund glared playfully at her, and then grinned at Peter.
Oh yes, me and my pitiless evil sisters. And brother.
To Jill and Eustace's great surprise, Peter stuck out his tongue at Edmund in a most unkingly fashion, and swatted him over the head, and then stepped over to the cookie dough, hesitating with his finger above it.
May I?
He asked Jill courteously. Jill giggled and nodded, giving Eustace a pointed look.
At least your cousin is polite enough to ask,
she remarked with a grin.
Eustace shrugged. It only took 3 words to explain the difference between him and Peter.
He's a king.
Doesn't mean you can't be polite too,
Jill retorted.
Peter tasted the cookie dough and let out a sigh of satisfaction.
It's magnificent,
he stated, smiling at Jill's delighted grin.
Rather,
added Eustace, grabbing a bit more and earning a glare from Jill.